In this section of the course, we're going to start looking at how to bring geometry from Rhino into Revit, and how to tell Revit what to do with it, and basically how to behave. My colleagues sometimes joke that my biggest job at the office is getting things into Revit, which is not entirely untrue also. So we have an empty Rhino file. Basically, all that's in this Rhino file is the linked or attached Revit geometry. Let's go ahead and create some Rhino geometry in this file. We can create a box. Maybe you want to ask, why would you create a box in Rhino? You can do that in Revit. Yes, that is completely true. Some of the geometrical operations, like moving and rotating things in space, can sometimes be easier for architects and engineers to work with in Rhino than Revit. Obviously, this box I would probably prefer to model as a Revit family inside Revit natively, but let's use this as a simple exercise to get started. We have a box behind this wall. I'm going to save that box. So now actually, because we have only one box, one BREP, a closed polysurface or a closed extrusion in this file, and if I turn off the reference, that's everything in this file actually. We don't need to do what I normally do, is which I go File, Export Selected, like you remember I did with the map files, the DWG exports from the Rhino map earlier in the first section, in the setup section. So we can either select geometry and go File, Export Selected, or we can just save this file. I'm going to save this file and just call it something, boxes, for instance. Okay, now this is a Rhino file, a Rhino 5 file that I can go into Revit and import into my system. Again, repeating on what I said earlier, you can choose if you want to link CAD or import CAD. There's something to be said about the link tool, though, is that when you link geometry from Rhino into Revit, you can't choose the Rhino file format directly. You can only choose SAT files. So if you want to link geometry from Rhino, if that's really important to you, you have to export to SAT from Rhino. We'll look into that later. To get Rhino geometry natively into Revit, you want to go to the Import CAD. Set up the Rhino file type, choose Boxes, and then we choose the category with which to import using, the category of the geometry inside Revit. Now, I'm not going to do a long lecture about the behaviors of different categories in Revit. That would take forever. Important note to make, generic models usually most times work. They section quite nicely in plan views and sections. If you use the furniture category, the plan views and sections are not going to do a real cut through your geometry. So this is something to keep in mind. If you're modeling some kind of feature furniture inside Rhino and you import it into Revit using the furniture, it's going to give you basically the top view of that furniture look in plan drawings. Use generic model category if you have blobs in Rhino and you want them basically to show real cut in Revit. So I'm going to now do the generic model, click open, and there's our geometry. It's a box. You can put rebar in it, and that's basically it. You can copy it and rotate it and so on, but of course we prefer to do that in Rhino. If this is going to be kept as, if you're going to keep designing this element inside Rhino, it makes sense to just keep it as it is in Revit. You have access to some instance parameters and some type parameters, but very limited. Maybe most importantly for architects is that you don't have any ability to override the material of this element. How this element displays in 3D views is actually determined by the color of the layer. So black is going to turn into gray actually in Revit. But there's a number of things that we can do with this element. We can, for instance, do a section through it, like so. Open the section, and we can go to annotate aligned dimension and do an aligned dimension between the faces of the walls and the faces of the Rhino import. This works pretty well, actually. We can also do a spot elevation and get information about the top and bottom elevations of these elements, and we can also do spot coordinates and spot slopes on most geometry, not everything. One important thing that we want to do now in our Revit setup is that in our 3D DWG export view, we do not want to show the geometry that's coming from Rhino. If I'm making changes to these walls, I want to be able to quickly export them to the DWG file and then get them into the Rhino file that's attached into the design model that's called boxes. But I do not want that Rhino geometry to loop in the exchange of data. So I'm going to set up a pretty simple setting. You can do, if you have a work shared Revit file, you can do this with work sets. If you don't have a work shared Revit file, you can do this with view filters. So I'm going to create view filters inside this 3DWG export view that's going to turn off that box so it doesn't get exported back into Rhino. Double click on the keyboard key single V, go to filters. I'm going to add a filter by using edit new filter. I'm going to call this filter imported.3dm. That's imported Rhino files. I'm going to select these currently just for generic model categories and say that filter by type name equals, not equals, ends with .3dm. Now when I use this filter in my 3D view and turn visibility off, any element that's being imported into Revit with Rhino files is going to be hidden in this view. It's not hidden in any other views. It's not hidden in perspective views or 3D views or level 1 views, but in the view that I export back into Rhino, it's hidden, and that is a good thing. So let's expand on this a little bit. We can start adding some other geometry. I want to make a sphere. I want to make that sphere here, just like this, and then we're going to expand it a little bit. Very beautiful sphere. Maybe a little bit like this. And then maybe I want to apply a Boolean operation. Let's go to the solid tools. I want to do a Boolean difference. Select the surface or polysurface to subtract from. I'm going to subtract from the elliptical sphere. Enter. Click on the box. Enter. Oh, yep, that's pretty good. I can now hide, of course, the 3D view, and then I can just save this file. Let's also do some color manipulation. So I'm going to go to the layer setting and set up some reddish color of my things. They're not boxes anymore, but I keep the file name boxes. Save this. File, save. I will go back into the Revit file. I need to open the view that doesn't contain imported geometry. I'm going to delete this. Now, this is the kind of the sad part about this story, is that when you're using the import CAD tool in Revit, you always need to delete the elements before you bring them back in. Boxes, I keep generic model as the category, and there you go. Red boxes and elliptical sphere. Let's check the 3DWG export view, and there's no alien geometry here from Rhino because we have a view filter. So that now if I move this wall, I can export this file back into Rhino without getting double geometry in the Rhino setup. Alright, perfect. Now sometimes, and quite often actually, we need to display some kind of material information to the imported geometry. it's not always enough to just say that it's red. There's a couple of ways we can do this. I'm going to show a couple of methods. One of them is that we can select the geometry in Rhino and then export them to SAT files. Let's keep the file naming boxes, but I'm going to export this as SAT. All right. I'm going to delete this guy, go into Import CAD, and then choose File Type SAT files. You will notice that you can still keep this geometry on Revit categories. All right. And it's no longer the Rhino color, the color of the Rhino layer that determines the color of this element inside Revit. We have one mistake though, that the 3D-WG export view is applying a filter that only registers the 3DM imports. So we can add a new filter, go to Edit New, import a 3DM, and simply duplicate this filter. I'm going to rename that guy and give it the imported.sat. All right. Change the filter rule to type name ends with .sat. Okay, now we have covered both situations where we're hiding both imported SAT files and imported Rhino files. As I said before, this can be done with work sets in work shared models in Revit. All right, what now controls how this element looks in 3D views? That is actually the material of the category in object style. So if I go to generic model here and change the material from white matte to poche, for instance. Okay. Oh, that's actually not the case. I'm using generic models. I'm using boxes sat. Ah, I remember. It's in the imported objects. Imports in families. Poche, click OK. No, this is actually wrong. All right, I'm moving on from this. Just setting back the generic model to white matte. Feel free to edit and take away this section if you want to. We can use the same method of applying view filters to views to get some information about the geometry in 2D views. Let's take that section, for instance, where we're looking at the box and the elliptical sphere. So here we can import a filter, maybe the same filter that we just used with the SAT files, and apply a cut pattern with the color, black, some kind of pattern, diagonal crosshatch. Click OK. And you will see that now you can actually kind of cheat and display Rhino geometry and make it look like it has a Revit material. This is kind of, always cheating, but it will give for a lot of outcomes desired outcome, actually. All right. The last method of bringing this geometry into Revit that's going to create actually pretty close to native Revit family geometry, where you can also apply material as parameters to different parts of the geometry, is going to use a Dynamo script that's going to import SAT files directly into Revit. This is going to be covered in the next section, so please keep up.